Around the world, there are structures that modern history still cannot fully explain, monuments carved into living mountains, stones heavier than machines can easily move, solar calendars built into ridgelines, tombs lifted high into vertical cliffs, and roads that now lie beneath the sea. Some were built to control time, like the sun towers of Chankillo. This series is not about fantasy or lost super civilizations. It is about what real human beings, with real tools and real limitations, actually achieved long before modern machines ever existed. And once you see what they built, you may never look at the ancient world the same way again. The Shimao Skull Pyramid. For most of human history, the land along the northern edge of China's Great Loess Plateau seemed empty, shaped only by wind, dust, and slow-moving seasons. A place where nothing monumental was ever supposed to exist, and yet beneath that quiet surface, buried for more than 4,000 years, an entire forgotten world was waiting to be found. A stone city built not just with tools and labour, but with belief, fear, power, and human life itself, a place we now call Shimao. For decades after its accidental discovery in the 1970s, even trained archaeologists misunderstood what they were looking at, assuming the massive stone ruins belonged to a much later military outpost connected to the Great Wall, because the idea that a civilization could have carved and stacked such enormous stone blocks more than 4,000 years ago simply did not fit into the history books of that time. And yet, as the layers of earth were slowly peeled away in the late 1990s, the truth began to surface, and it was far older, far larger, and far more unsettling than anyone had expected. What emerged was not a fort, not a village, not a simple settlement, but one of the largest Stone Age cities ever discovered in East Asia, sprawling across hundreds of hectares, protected by towering defensive walls, watchtowers, gates, and a central stepped pyramid rising like a man-made mountain from the heart of the lost city. A pyramid so large that its base rivals some of the greatest monuments of the ancient world, built at a time when historians once believed such engineering was impossible in this region. The people who built Shimao lived long before the first Chinese dynasties written into history, long before the rise of familiar kings and empires, during an age when most of the world was still discovering the earliest forms of organized society. And yet here, far from the fertile bend of the Yellow River, they carved stone with precision, lifted blocks weighing thousands of kilograms, and designed a city that reflects not survival but control. And at the centre of this control stood the pyramid. At first it appeared to be like any other ancient monument, layered terraces of stone climbing slowly upward, stained by time and weather, its purpose unclear, perhaps a palace, a ceremonial platform, or the home of forgotten rulers. But as archaeologists cut deeper into its foundation, something far darker revealed itself, hidden not in shallow graves, not beneath burial chambers, but sealed directly into the walls of the structure itself. Human skulls, dozens at first, then hundreds, and now, archaeologists believe, thousands still remain locked inside the stone. Most of them belong not to warriors, not to criminals, not to elderly rulers, but to young women, teenagers, and children. Their bones arranged deliberately, layered between stone blocks like offerings, placed at gateways, foundations, and key structural points, turning the pyramid into something more than architecture, something closer to a living altar. These were not accidental deaths, they were sacrifices. In the belief system of Shimao, blood was not something to be hidden, it was something to be used, something powerful enough to seal walls, protect gates, and anchor the city's spiritual centre to the unseen forces they believed governed the world. And in doing so, the builders transformed the pyramid into a fusion of stone and human life, a monument that did not merely rise above the dead, but was literally constructed through them. The city that surrounded this pyramid was vast, divided into social layers that can still be traced through the ruins, elite zones built higher on the slopes, workshops and storage areas carved into lower levels, massive defensive walls encircling everything, all of it suggesting a society that was sharply organised, deeply hierarchical, and ruled by an authority powerful enough to command both labour and sacrifice on an enormous scale. Inside the stonework, archaeologists found symbols carved into the walls, strange eye-like shapes inlaid with jade, staring outward as if watching eternally, patterns of animals and geometric forms whose meanings are still debated today, and while no written language has been found to tell us the names of the gods worshipped here, or the rulers who commanded these rituals, the scale of the construction itself serves as their signature, a silent declaration of power preserved through stone. At its peak, Shimao may have housed tens of thousands of people, farmers, builders, artisans, soldiers, priests and rulers, all bound together by a system of belief that told them the survival of their city, their harvests, their families, and perhaps even the stars above, depended on the offerings made at the heart of their pyramid, a system where sacrifice was not seen as destruction, but as necessary exchange. And then, just as suddenly as it rose, Shimao fell silent. By around 1900 BCE, the city was abandoned. There is no clear evidence of a final siege, no mass grave of fallen defenders, no gradual shrinking into decay, only empty streets, deserted terraces, and stone walls left standing under open sky, as if the inhabitants simply walked away and never returned. Climate clues suggest long droughts, shifting rivers, and collapsing trade routes may have made life here impossible, but whatever the reason, the people vanished, taking their language, their rituals, their rulers, and their memories with them, leaving only the skeleton of their civilization behind. Over the centuries, dust storms from the plateau rolled across the ruins, layer after layer of yellow earth settling over the city, until the pyramid itself became little more than a rocky hill in the distance, mistaken for a natural formation by generations who passed nearby without realizing they were walking above a once living world built on blood and belief. It would take modern excavation, satellite mapping, and decades of careful digging for Shimao to return to the surface, forcing historians to confront a difficult truth: that China's earliest civilizations were far more complex, violent, and technologically advanced than previously imagined, and that the roots of organised power in this region run far deeper than any written record ever captured. Shimao does not fit comfortably into the neat story of gradual progress, peaceful villages, and slow evolution toward empire, because this city shows us something else entirely: that human civilization has always walked a narrow line between creation and destruction, between order and sacrifice, between stone lifted toward the sky and lives buried beneath it. And even now, with its walls exposed to sunlight for the first time in 4,000 years, Shimao still keeps most of its secrets, thousands of skulls still hidden within its foundation, thousands of untold stories sealed in stone, reminding us that the greatest monuments of the ancient world were not only built with ingenuity and labour, but with choices that echo far beyond their time. This is where our journey begins, at a place where power first learned to shape stone, and where belief learned to shape human life itself. The rock temples of Barabar. For more than 2,000 years, the hills of eastern India have watched empires rise and collapse, rivers change course, religions transform, and civilizations rewrite themselves again and again. Yet carved into the hardest living rock of those hills exists a group of chambers so precise, so smooth, and so technically advanced that even today they quietly challenge everything we think we know about ancient construction, a place now known as the Barabar Caves, where a stone was not merely shaped, but polished to a perfection that borders on the impossible. These caves are not formed by nature, and they are not rough shelters or primitive hollows carved with crude tools, but perfectly engineered granite chambers cut directly into solid mountains, their interiors reflecting light like mirrors, their walls so smooth that sound does not simply echo within them, it vibrates, amplifies, and lingers as if the stone itself is alive. Granite is one of the hardest natural materials on Earth, harder than iron, harder than bronze, difficult even for modern machines to cut cleanly, and yet more than 2,300 years ago, ancient builders carved these chambers with such precision that not a single tool mark remains visible, not a single uneven surface breaks the reflection of light, leaving behind a polish so flawless that modern engineers still struggle to explain exactly how it was achieved. Every curve inside these caves is mathematically controlled, every corner perfectly joined, every ceiling smoothed as if melted rather than carved, creating a surface finish that modern historians now call the Mauryan polish. Yet no documented method from ancient India fully explains how this level of refinement was physically possible using the tools believed to exist at the time. The caves were created during the reign of Ashoka, one of the most powerful and transformative rulers in ancient history, an emperor who began his life as a brutal conqueror and later turned towards spiritual rule and the spread of Dharma, and it was under his authority that these chambers were gifted to ascetic monks, not as palaces, not as tombs, but as spaces for silent meditation carved directly out of the bones of the earth itself. Yet what makes Barabar truly unsettling is not their spiritual purpose, but the technology frozen into their walls, because while Ashoka's inscriptions tell us who commissioned the caves, they tell us almost nothing about how they were made, and the craftsmanship displayed here does not match the limitations historians once believed defined this era. The entrances alone are carved with such precision that the rock seems sliced rather than struck, doorways that fit so perfectly into the stone that even light struggles to escape their edges, leading inward into chambers shaped like eggs, domes, and vaults, where voices become thunder and whispers feel alive, bouncing endlessly across the mirror like granite surfaces. Inside these chambers, light behaves differently, reflecting cleanly without distortion, as if the stone had been polished with techniques more akin to optical engineering than primitive stonework, and when you run your hand across the surface there is no grain, no roughness, no hint of chisel or abrasion, only a glass-like coldness that feels completely out of place in a structure over 2,000 years old. Modern engineers have attempted to recreate this polish using steel tools, industrial abrasives, and machine grinding, and even with modern technology, achieving the same flawless uniformity across entire cave interiors remains slow, expensive, and extraordinarily difficult, raising a quiet but persistent question that continues to linger at Barabar. What did the ancients know that we no longer fully understand? These caves were not hidden creations, not secret experiments, but official state-sponsored monuments, gifted publicly to monks of the Ajivika order, their dedication inscriptions still visible near the entrances, carved cleanly into the granite with crisp edges that remain sharp even after 20 centuries of erosion, another silent reminder that the tools used here were not crude. Outside the caves, the hills appear ordinary, rounded and weathered by time, giving no hint that their interiors hold some of the most technically refined stonework ever achieved by ancient hands. And this contrast between the natural roughness of the outer rock and the unnatural perfection of the inner chambers only deepens the mystery of how these spaces were carved at all. There are no half-finished tunnels at Barabar, no abandoned attempts, no visible stages of failure, as if every cut was planned with absolute certainty from the beginning, a level of confidence that suggests the builders were not experimenting, but executing a knowledge system already perfected. The echoes inside these chambers behave in strange ways, amplifying sound until it feels physical, pressing against the chest, creating vibrations that ancient monks likely used deliberately for meditative and ceremonial practices, allowing voice and breath to interact directly with polished stone in ways that modern acoustic science is only beginning to fully measure. In this way, Barabar was not only a place of shelter or reflection, but a carefully engineered environment where sound, light, and silence were controlled with deliberate intent, transforming bare stone into an instrument of the mind. And yet, despite imperial inscriptions and spiritual dedication, the greatest mystery remains unsolved, because there are no surviving descriptions of the methods used to cut, smooth, and polish these caves, no tools preserved, no instructional texts recorded, leaving historians with only the physical evidence carved into the rock itself. Some suggest long periods of abrasive polishing using sand and plant fibres. Others propose lost mechanical techniques, while more radical theories speak of forgotten technologies that existed briefly and vanished without record. But none of these explanations fully account for the scale, speed, and uniform perfection seen across multiple chambers cut into some of the hardest natural stone available on Earth. Time usually erodes precision. At Barabar, time has only preserved it. Even after thousands of years of earthquakes, monsoon rains, temperature changes, and wind erosion, the interior polish still reflects light like metal, and the curves of the walls remain geometrically true, as though the caves were finished only yesterday. Beyond their engineering, these caves sit at a turning point in Indian history, at the moment when imperial power first began to align itself openly with spiritual life on a massive scale, when rulers like Ashoka sought to reshape society not only through conquest, but through belief, charity, and the architecture of introspection itself. Yet ironically, the very structures meant to embody spiritual simplicity now stand as one of the greatest technological riddles of the ancient world, a place where meditation and machine-level precision coexist in silent contradiction. And as generations passed, as kingdoms fell and new religions rose across the subcontinent, the true knowledge behind Barabar slowly slipped away, leaving future civilizations to inherit the result without understanding the process that created it. Today, visitors stand inside these stone chambers and see their own reflections staring back from a mirror made of solid granite, a sight that feels both beautiful and deeply unsettling, because it quietly tells us that the past was not always primitive, not always uncertain, not always struggling forward in darkness. Sometimes the past was precise, sometimes it was confident, sometimes it reached a level of mastery that later ages would fail to rediscover. And the rock temples of Barabar remain as silent witnesses to that forgotten mastery, chambers cut not just into stone, but into the limits of what we believe ancient humans were capable of achieving. Stone remembers, even when history forgets. The great stone coffins of Sulawesi. Far from the crowded coastlines and expanding cities of Indonesia lies the mountainous interior of Sulawesi, where for centuries people chose not to bury their dead beneath the ground, but instead carved their final resting places directly into sheer cliff faces, creating multi-ton stone coffins suspended high above the forest floor in locations so difficult to access that even modern climbers approach them with caution. Unlike ordinary graves, these cliff coffins were carved horizontally into solid rock using slow manual techniques that relied on fire setting, repeated impact, and long abrasion with harder stone, a process that could take months or years for a single burial chamber, after which a separate stone lid weighing several tons had to be lifted and sealed into position using only ropes, wooden frames, and human force without any form of machinery. Burial here was never an instant process, because the dead were often kept within the household for extended periods while families prepared the coffin, gathered resources, and organised the massive labour required to transport the body and stone into the cliffs, reinforcing the belief that death was not a sudden separation, but a gradual transition between the living world and the ancestral realm. When the burial day arrived, entire villages assembled to build scaffolding against the cliff walls from wood and plant fibres, forming temporary structures that extended dangerously outward over open air. And once the frame was secured, teams of people coordinated slow, continuous pulling movements to haul the coffin upward and guide it precisely into the carved opening, where a mistake could mean fatal collapse. Social hierarchy was permanently written into the mountains themselves, because higher cliff levels were reserved for powerful clan leaders and nobles, while lower sections were used for common families, creating a vertical structure of status that remained visible long after the living communities changed or disappeared. Inside many of these coffins, archaeologists have found skeletal remains placed alongside pottery, metal tools, ornaments, and personal belongings, showing that the afterlife was understood as a continuation of real existence, where identity and material life still mattered beyond physical death. In several regions, wooden effigies were later placed beside the burial openings to represent the deceased in human form, standing silently on narrow ledges carved into the rock and staring outward across the valleys where their descendants continued to live, turning the cliffs into visible ancestral landscapes rather than hidden cemeteries. The land itself shaped this tradition because Sulawesi sits on one of the most geologically active zones on Earth, where mountains rise, earthquakes strike, and rain rapidly destroys wood and soil structures, making stone the only material that offered true permanence in an environment of constant change. For most of recorded history, these cliff cemeteries remained unknown beyond local tradition because the highlands were isolated and rarely entered by outsiders, and it was only in the modern era that researchers began to understand the full scale of these burial systems spread across multiple valleys and mountain regions. Even today, many coffins remain sealed and unexplored, either because they are too dangerous to reach or because local communities restrict access out of respect for ancestral customs, preserving their contents as they have remained for centuries. What makes the Sulawesi coffins unique among burial traditions worldwide is not only their physical scale or dangerous placement, but the way death remains openly visible within everyday life, where ancestors occupy the same visual landscape as farms, villages, and roads rather than disappearing beneath the earth. Modern funeral traditions in parts of Sulawesi still reflect this worldview, where the deceased may be kept within the family home for long periods before final burial ceremonies are performed, continuing the idea that death is not an instant event but a slow departure from social presence. From an engineering standpoint alone, these coffins represent an extraordinary level of practical knowledge, requiring precise judgment of weight, structural balance, and lever force without written mathematics or standardized tools, demonstrating that advanced problem solving can develop through tradition and necessity rather than formal science. Over centuries, rain, vegetation, and earthquakes have damaged some sites, but many of the stone coffins remain exactly where they were placed, still sealed into the cliffs with no maintenance and no support beyond the mountain itself. The great stone coffins of Sulawesi therefore stand as permanent records of how an ancient society transformed fear of death into acts of endurance, labour, and architectural permanence, carving memory directly into the bones of the earth. Long after the villages that created them have faded, these coffins continue to hang silently above the forest, holding the remains of people whose names are forgotten, but whose presence still shapes the landscape itself. The Shigir megastructures beneath the idol, deep within the cold wetlands of western Siberia, lies one of the most unexpected archaeological landscapes ever uncovered, a site known today as the Shigir site, where buried beneath layers of peat and waterlogged soil, archaeologists discovered the remains of massive wooden constructions so ancient that they predate the pyramids of Egypt by several millennia. For most of human history, wood was considered an unreliable material for deep archaeological time because it decays quickly, dissolves in soil, and vanishes completely within a few centuries. Yet at Shigir, the unique chemistry of the peat bog created an oxygen-free environment that halted decay and preserved wooden structures for nearly 12,000 years, allowing modern science to encounter architecture from a time long before agriculture, cities, and written language. The discovery began in the late 19th century when gold miners digging through peat uncovered strange carved wooden fragments, and among them was a towering sculpted figure now known as the Shigir idol, a wooden monument covered in geometric symbols and human faces that was later dated to more than 11,000 years old, making it the oldest known monumental wooden sculpture on Earth. But the idol was only the visible survivor of a much larger hidden environment, because beneath the peat layers, archaeologists eventually discovered the remnants of extensive wooden platforms, beams, walkways, posts, and structural frameworks arranged deliberately across the ancient wetland landscape, forming what researchers now describe as megastructures built entirely from timber during a period when human society was still organised mainly around hunting and gathering. Radiocarbon dating revealed that many of these constructions date back to around 10 to 12,000 years ago, pushing complex large-scale engineering back to a time when humanity was supposedly only beginning to transition out of the last ice age, long before the rise of farming settlements, long before metallurgy, and long before the appearance of permanent urban life as traditionally defined by archaeology. The scale of these buried wooden constructions completely changed how researchers understood early human capability, because these were not random shelters or temporary hunting platforms, but carefully planned structures that required tree harvesting, shaping, transport, and precise assembly, all coordinated at a level that implied long-term organisation, shared planning, and cultural continuity across generations. Some of the wooden beams extend for many metres in straight alignment, forming what appear to be raised walkways across swampy terrain, while others stand vertically like posts or markers that may have supported elevated platforms or ceremonial spaces above the wet ground, showing that this ancient population was actively transforming its landscape rather than merely adapting to it. The labour required to build on this scale using only stone tools would have been immense, because trees had to be felled without metal axes, shaped without steel blades, and transported without wheels or animals of burden, requiring continual human effort applied across seasons and probably across multiple generations, suggesting that these structures were not short-term solutions but long-term investments into communal space. What makes these megastructures especially difficult to classify is that they do not fit neatly into later categories of villages, temples, or fortifications, because the people who built them lived in a world without domesticated crops, without livestock herding at scale, and without formal political hierarchies as traditionally understood, yet they still produced architecture on a scale that rivals early agricultural societies. The preservation of these wooden constructions was purely accidental, because without the peat bog's anaerobic chemistry, every beam and post would have disappeared completely, meaning that similar wooden worlds may once have covered vast portions of prehistoric landscapes, but vanished without leaving any trace. The Shigir idol likely stood within or near this architectural complex as a symbolic or spiritual centerpiece, because its surface is carved with repeated faces and geometric patterns that appear intentional and narrative in nature, implying belief systems, symbolic communication, and possibly ritual practice embedded into the very construction of the surrounding wooden environment. Microscopic analysis of tool marks on the wood shows that the builders used carefully shaped stone tools with consistent cutting angles, meaning that their craftsmanship followed standardized methods rather than improvised single-use techniques, indicating that knowledge was being transmitted accurately across time. Environmental evidence suggests that this region was once a dynamic wetland filled with lakes, marshes, and forest islands, and the construction of raised timber walkways would have allowed controlled movement across difficult terrain, improving transport, hunting access, and possibly ceremonial procession routes through otherwise impassable landscapes. The idea that hunter-gatherer societies only lived in temporary shelters collapses at Shigir, because everything about these constructions points toward permanent or semi-permanent occupation with long-term planning, landscape modification, and symbolic architecture integrated directly into everyday survival. What also makes Shigir unsettling is the timeline itself, because these wooden megastructures may be older than the earliest stone architecture anywhere on Earth, meaning that humanity's first large communal spaces may have been built from wood, not stone, and only appear later in the archaeological record because stone survives while wood disappears. This creates a distorted picture of prehistory where earlier chapters of monumental construction are effectively erased simply because their materials were biodegradable rather than mineral. The discovery forces archaeologists to reconsider what early humans were capable of long before farming emerged, because the coordination required to build platforms and walkways of this scale implies social organisation, leadership structures, labour scheduling, and shared long-term goals that were previously believed to only arise after agricultural surplus developed. Climate data shows that these structures were built during a period of major environmental change as the Ice Age ended and forests expanded across Eurasia, meaning that these societies were not only adapting to rapid climate shifts but actively engineering their surroundings to maintain mobility and stability in unstable conditions. Over time, rising water levels slowly submerged these constructions beneath accumulating peat, sealing them away into an underground archive that remained untouched for thousands of years until mining operations accidentally reopened this frozen chapter of human engineering. Even today, only a small portion of the Shigir megastructures have been fully excavated because removing waterlogged wood requires extremely careful conservation to prevent instant collapse and decay once oxygen reaches the ancient fibres, making every excavation slow, expensive, and technically demanding. Much of what still lies beneath the peat remains unmapped, and it is entirely possible that the visible walkways and platforms are only fragments of a much larger engineered environment stretching far beyond the exposed excavation zones. What Shigir ultimately represents is a missing stage in the story of civilization, a moment when humans were already shaping landscapes, organising massive building projects, and embedding symbolic meaning into architecture long before the appearance of kingdoms, writing, agriculture, or metal technology. It shows that complexity did not suddenly appear with farming, but was already developing deep inside prehistoric societies that relied on hunting, fishing, and foraging, while simultaneously executing engineering projects that permanently altered their environments. The Shigir megastructures stand as proof that the earliest chapters of human architecture were not written in stone, but in timber and water, and that only by rare geological accident did any part of that world survive long enough for modern science to encounter it. Long after the trees that once formed these platforms fell, and long after the people who built them vanished, the wetland remembered their work, storing it silently beneath layers of peat until modern tools uncovered a world that was never meant to last this long. And beneath the towering wooden idol that still carries the carved faces of a forgotten belief system, the buried megastructures remind us that humanity was shaping space, belief, and architecture thousands of years earlier than history once allowed. The Basalt Road of Bimini. Just beneath the calm, shallow turquoise waters off the western edge of the Bimini lies one of the most controversial underwater formations ever discovered. A long arrangement of massive flat stone slabs aligned in an orderly pattern that stretches across the seabed like a paved roadway, a structure now widely known as the Bimini Road, which has fueled decades of debate over whether it is a purely natural creation or the submerged remnant of something once built by human hands. The stones themselves rest in water only a few meters deep, making them easily visible to divers and even to boats passing overhead on clear days, arranged in a single continuous line that extends for hundreds of meters before gradually breaking apart into scattered blocks, each slab fitted against the next with edges so straight and surfaces so flat that the formation immediately gives the impression of deliberate construction rather than random geological collapse. Most of the individual blocks weigh several tons each and are composed primarily of beach rock and limestone that has hardened through long exposure to mineral-rich coastal environments, yet what draws attention is not merely the material, but the geometric order in which it appears to be placed, with right-angled joints, linear alignment, and consistent spacing that resemble paved causeways or harbour structures seen in known ancient civilizations. The Bimini Road entered global attention in 1968 when pilots flying over the area first noticed the unusual line of stones beneath the surface and informed researchers, after which underwater surveys quickly confirmed that the formation was neither a simple reef nor a typical natural rock outcrop, because its organisation differed strongly from surrounding seabed features. Soon after discovery, the site became linked to speculation about the legendary lost civilization of Atlantis, largely because early 20th century psychic Edgar Cayce had predicted that ruins of Atlantis would be found near Bimini before the end of the 1960s, a coincidence that immediately propelled the site into public imagination far beyond the normal boundaries of marine geology or academic archaeology. From a scientific standpoint, however, the central question has always remained narrowly focused on formation process rather than mythology, because if the Bimini Road is natural, then its precise alignment must be explained through sedimentation, tectonic fracturing, and coastal erosion, while if it is artificial, then it would represent a submerged engineering project whose builders and purpose have yet to be identified in the archaeological record. Geologists who have examined the site closely generally describe the structure as a formation of beach rock that fractured along natural joint lines as sea levels rose after the last ice age, causing large slabs to break apart in relatively straight segments and then settle into linear arrangements through wave action and gravity, producing patterns that appear deliberately paved even though they formed without human involvement. This explanation is supported by the fact that beach rock commonly forms in shallow intertidal zones, where sand, shell fragments, and sediments become cemented together through mineral precipitation, later hardening into stone that can fracture in rectilinear patterns when stressed by shifting water levels and underwater currents. At the same time, critics of the purely geological explanation argue that parts of the road show multiple layers of rocks, stacked atop one another, and occasional curved features that resemble harbour turning points, suggesting that at least some degree of artificial placement may have occurred after initial natural formation, possibly by early coastal peoples adapting existing stone slabs for maritime use. Radiocarbon dating of material associated with the stones generally places their formation within the last several thousand years rather than at extreme prehistoric depths, which complicates claims that the road could belong to a vanished Ice Age civilization, but it does not entirely rule out human modification during later coastal settlement phases. What further fuels debate is that the broader Bimini region contains additional submerged features, including stone circles, scattered block formations, and what some researchers interpret as collapsed walls or jetties, although many of these features remain poorly mapped and difficult to separate from normal reef processes without extensive long-term excavation. The sea level in this region has risen dramatically since the end of the last glacial period, meaning that land once exposed may now lie dozens of metres underwater, and this fact alone ensures that ancient coastal sites, whether natural or human-made, could now rest beneath the surface in forms that are difficult to interpret. Unlike stone ruins found on land, the Bimini Road exists in an environment where waves, currents, coral growth, and sediment movement constantly reshape its appearance, complicating any attempt to identify clear construction markers such as tool cuts, mortise joints, or consistent foundation layers. No definitive inscriptions, carved symbols, or manufactured artifacts have yet been recovered directly from the road itself that would clearly identify it as the product of organised human construction, and this absence remains the strongest argument used by mainstream archaeologists to classify the formation as a geological structure rather than a submerged roadway built by an ancient civilization. At the same time, the emotional power of seeing such large, flat stones arranged so cleanly on the ocean floor continues to challenge public intuition, because human vision is extremely sensitive to linear order, and once a paved pattern is perceived, it becomes difficult to view the formation as an accident of erosion alone. For local Bahamian communities, the site exists less as a battleground of scientific theory and more as a distinctive part of the marine landscape that draws divers, researchers, and tourists from around the world, bringing economic activity while also introducing external narratives that often clash with local tradition and experience. From a structural perspective, the Bimini Road does not resemble a road in the modern transportation sense because it lacks clear width, standardization, layered foundation, or connecting pathways inland. Yet it does resemble breakwaters and harbour platforms known from later historical periods, which encourages interpretations that it may once have served as a protective coastal barrier rather than a transit route. If such a function were ever confirmed, it would imply that early coastal populations possessed both the organisational capacity and maritime motivation to reshape their shoreline using heavy stone materials, a capability that is well documented in some later ancient ports but not definitively established in this specific region. The controversy surrounding the site has persisted largely because it sits at the boundary between two scientific realities, one in which nature is fully capable of producing remarkable geometric patterns through fracture mechanics and sedimentation, and another in which the earliest human societies repeatedly demonstrated an ability to adapt natural materials into functional construction without leaving behind obvious markers recognisable to later archaeologists. Underwater archaeology itself remains a technically demanding field where excavation proceeds slowly, and every intervention risks damaging fragile marine environments or displacing formations that can never be returned to their original state, meaning that definitive investigation of the Bimini Road progresses far more cautiously than similar efforts on land. As a result, decades after its discovery, the formation remains in a suspended interpretive state, classified by mainstream science as natural, while continuing to inspire alternative theories that connect it to lost civilizations, global flood mythology, and the idea of submerged prehistoric cultures erased by post-ice age sea level rise. What makes the Bimini Road enduringly powerful is not necessarily what it proves, but what it reveals about the limits of certainty when archaeology intersects with geology beneath the ocean, where direct evidence is difficult to recover and visual impression often outweighs material confirmation in shaping public belief. The Atlantic Ocean has swallowed vast portions of ancient coastlines across the world, and with them untold numbers of human settlements, camps, and ceremonial spaces whose remains have been scattered by waves and buried by sediment, meaning that the absence of evidence on the Bimini seabed does not automatically mean the absence of ancient human activity in the region. At the same time, extraordinary conclusions require extraordinary proof, and until artifacts, tool marks, or buried structural foundations are conclusively documented beneath the stones, the Bimini Road must remain suspended between natural wonder and unresolved possibility rather than confirmed monument. The Devil's Wall of Teutoburg. Hidden within the wooded ridges and misty valleys of northern Germany lies one of Europe's least understood ancient constructions, a long, broken stone barrier known today as the Devil's Wall, stretching across the landscape near the edge of the Teutoburg forest, a region already known for its deep association with early tribal resistance and the shifting boundary between the Roman world and the peoples of ancient Germania. Locally called the Teufelsmauer or Devil's Wall, this structure extends in scattered segments for many kilometres across hills, ridgelines, and forested slopes, constructed from large stacked stone blocks that follow the contours of the terrain with no clear beginning and no obvious end, forming a barrier that appears deliberate in placement yet remains unclear in purpose. Unlike city walls or fortress defences built around settlements, the Devil's Wall does not enclose a known ancient town, nor does it form the boundary of a clearly defined military site, but instead moves across open countryside, cutting through natural elevations as if it were marking a line through the land rather than protecting a single location. For generations, local legends attributed the wall to supernatural origins, claiming it was built by the devil himself in a single night, a story born not from folklore alone, but from genuine confusion over how such a long stone structure could exist in a region where no written records describe its construction and no nearby ruins clearly explain its function. From an archaeological perspective, the wall presents a far more grounded but equally puzzling problem because it does not match the standardized engineering style of the Roman Empire, yet it also shows a level of planning and endurance that exceeds what is usually associated with short-term tribal fortifications. The stones themselves vary in size, but are generally large enough to require organised labour to transport and stack, and although no advanced mortar was used, their placement is stable enough that many sections have survived centuries of erosion, freezing winters, and forest growth without complete collapse. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found near some wall sections suggests that parts of the structure may predate full Roman expansion into the region, placing its construction somewhere in the late Iron Age, before the Romans established permanent control east of the Rhine. This time period coincides with the historical presence of various Germanic tribal groups, including confederations that later confronted Roman legions during attempts at territorial expansion, making the wall's location particularly intriguing because it occupies a region that would soon become a violent frontier between two fundamentally different political worlds. The Devil's Wall does not resemble the later Roman frontier systems such as the limes, which were carefully engineered with standardized dimensions, forts, watchtowers, and road networks, because the Teutoburg Wall lacks permanent military installations and show no consistent defensive layout that would support a large garrison. For this reason, many researchers believe the wall was not a border in the Roman sense, but may have served as a territorial boundary between tribal groups, a ceremonial demarcation line, or a controlled passage route used to guide movement through difficult terrain rather than to stop invasions. The terrain itself supports this idea because the wall often runs along ridgelines and elevated ground where visibility is high, suggesting that it was positioned to be seen rather than hidden, marking the landscape visually as much as physically. In some areas, the wall appears to be aligned with natural bottlenecks between hills and valleys, where large groups of people or animals would naturally pass, raising the possibility that it functioned as a form of regulated corridor or symbolic gateway rather than a continuous defensive rampart. What makes the wall especially difficult to interpret is the absence of associated settlements directly connected to its length, because unlike classic fortifications that are anchored to towns, forts, or castles, the Devil's Wall stands largely alone across the forest, detached from clear centres of population. Over the centuries, surrounding villages reused many stones from the wall for churches, farm buildings, and road foundations, breaking its continuity and further obscuring its original shape, which means that what survives today is only a fragment of the full structure as it once existed. Historical silence deepens the puzzle, because Roman historians who carefully documented their campaigns in Germania make no direct mention of a long native stone barrier in this region, even though they recorded smaller tribal earthworks and timber fortifications elsewhere. This absence could mean the wall predates Roman contact entirely, or that it no longer served a significant military purpose by the time Roman forces reached the area, existing instead as a landscape marker whose original function had already faded into memory. The forest itself has changed dramatically since ancient times, because what is now dense woodland was once more open, allowing long-distance visibility along ridgelines where the wall would have been clearly visible for travellers and rival communities alike. This suggests that the wall may have been intended not primarily as a physical barrier, but as a visual statement of territory, authority, and controlled space, functioning as a stone signal that one domain had ended and another had begun. In this way, the Devil's Wall belongs to a rare category of structures that operate at the boundary between engineering and symbolism, where the act of building itself serves as the primary message rather than the defensive strength of the construction. Some sections show evidence of repeated rebuilding and repair over long periods, indicating that the wall was maintained across generations rather than abandoned after a single brief use, which implies long-term cultural or political importance rather than short-lived military need. What remains most striking is that no unified theory fully explains why such a long stone barrier was built in a region dominated for most of its early history by mobile tribal groups who typically favoured timber, earthworks, and short-term defences over long permanent stone construction. The existence of this wall therefore implies either a previously unknown phase of structural ambition among pre-Roman communities or a specialised purpose that demanded a level of permanence not otherwise seen in their settlements. Modern archaeological surveys using aerial imaging and ground-penetrating methods suggest that additional wall segments remain buried beneath forest floor and farmland, meaning that the full length of the Devil's Wall may be significantly greater than what is currently visible. Even so, the excavation process remains slow because the wall lies within protected natural landscapes where large-scale digging is restricted to prevent damage to the forest ecosystems that have grown around the ruins over the centuries. Today, the Devil's Wall does not dominate the horizon as it once did, but instead appears in fragments between trees, emerging unexpectedly along hiking trails and rocky outcrops, where its stacked stones rise from the soil without explanation or inscription. Visitors often pass it without realizing that they are standing beside a construction whose original builders left no written record, no surviving myths of its true purpose, and no clear architectural parallels elsewhere in Germany. What the wall ultimately represents is a rare physical imprint from a time when power, territory, and identity were defined locally rather than imperially, before standardized borders and bureaucratic maps imposed uniform meaning onto landscapes. It stands as a reminder that not every ancient structure fits comfortably into later historical frameworks, and that many early societies expressed their boundaries and authority through methods that modern categories struggle to interpret. Long after Roman legions marched, long after medieval kingdoms rose and collapsed, and long after the forests reclaimed most traces of early settlements, the Devil's Wall remains embedded in the land as a line without a label, a boundary without a recorded reason. The stones do not tell us who built the wall with certainty, and they do not explain why it was stretched across the forest in the first place, but they do confirm that long before modern borders were drawn, human beings were already marking space with enduring material intent. And in the silence of the Teutoburg Hills, where wind moves through trees that did not yet exist when the wall was first raised, the Devil's Wall continues to exist not as a monument of conquest or empire, but as a lingering question carved into the terrain itself. The Andean, Gate of the Moon. High in the thin air of the central Andes, where the ground slopes sharply upward toward bare rock ridges and the sky feels unnaturally close, there exists a solitary stone portal known today as the Gate of the Moon, carved directly into a living mountainside with no surrounding buildings, no associated ruins, and no clearly defined settlement that would normally explain why such a precise architectural feature was created in complete isolation. Unlike monumental gateways found within cities or ceremonial centres, this portal stands alone in solid rock, framed by rough mountain stone on all sides, as if it were cut into the earth for a purpose that did not require walls, streets, or permanent habitation around it, immediately raising the question of whether this was meant to be an entrance in the physical sense, or a symbolic threshold intended for ritual, astronomy, or belief. The portal is rectangular, sharply edged, and proportioned with careful symmetry despite being carved into extremely hard Andean bedrock, a type of stone that resists shaping even with modern tools, which means its creators would have required prolonged effort, consistent technique, and substantial labour investment, despite the fact that the site offers no obvious practical advantage, such as shelter, defence, or settlement infrastructure. There are no collapsed roofs nearby, no stone dwellings clustered around it, no road foundations clearly linking it to a larger architectural complex, and no written inscriptions identifying its builders, which places the Gate of the Moon into a rare category of structures that exist without contextual explanation, forcing interpretation to rely entirely on landscape position, tool marks, and cultural comparison rather than documentary record. The portal's alignment within the mountain is deliberate rather than random, because it is positioned along a natural ridge path that ancient travellers would have used to cross between valleys, meaning that anyone moving through this stretch of the Andes in antiquity would have encountered the gate directly along their route, rather than discovering it accidentally off to the side. This placement strongly suggests that the gate was designed to be encountered in motion, not approached as a destination in itself, reinforcing the idea that it functioned as a controlled symbolic passage rather than the entrance to a permanent structure. In Andean belief systems that developed long before and alongside the Inca Empire, mountains were not inert geological features but living entities believed to possess consciousness, power, and spiritual agency, and carving directly into a mountain was therefore not a neutral architectural act but a direct intervention into sacred terrain. Within this worldview, stone portals were not simply doorways between physical spaces, but thresholds between different states of reality, separating ordinary human movement from ritualized transition, making it possible that the Gate of the Moon functioned as a ceremonial boundary rather than a conventional architectural entrance. The name Gate of the Moon is a modern label based on regional tradition and symbolic interpretation rather than an inscription left by its builders, but the association with lunar meaning is consistent with Andean cosmology, where the moon governed water cycles, fertility, timekeeping, and aspects of female spiritual power, making lunar symbolism a core component of ritual landscape design. No clear iconography is carved onto the portal itself, which distinguishes it from later ceremonial gateways such as the famous solar portal at Tiwanaku, where the iconography overtly communicates religious narrative and political authority, whereas the Gate of the Moon remains intentionally unadorned, drawing attention purely through form and placement rather than written or symbolic imagery. The lack of surrounding ruins has led some researchers to suggest that the gate was never part of a city or temple complex, but instead belonged to a now lost system of sacred pathways that once connected highland ritual sites across long distances, functioning as fixed nodes of ceremonial movement rather than as static population centres. In such a system, architecture would not be concentrated into dense urban spaces, but instead distributed across the landscape, with isolated gateways, carved platforms, and mountain shrines marking key points along pilgrimage routes that address spiritual movement rather than economic settlement. Geological analysis shows that the portal was carved from the same continuous bedrock as the surrounding mountain face, confirming that it was not assembled from blocks, but cut directly into living stone, a method that requires far more labour than constructing with modular stones, but produces a permanence that resists seismic damage and weathering in a region where earthquakes and temperature extremes are constant forces. Tool marks along the inner edges of the gate suggest deliberate shaping using repeated impact and abrasion rather than crude fracturing, meaning the builders worked with controlled precision rather than brute force alone, even though no metal fragments associated with the carving have been recovered at the site. The altitude at which the gate is located introduces significant physical difficulty for prolonged labour, because oxygen levels are lower, weather conditions change rapidly, and transport of tools and supplies becomes far more demanding, which implies that the decision to carve here was not driven by convenience, but by symbolic necessity tied to the mountain itself. From a functional standpoint, the portal does not lead into a chamber, tunnel, or hidden interior space, because passing through it simply returns the traveller to open rock and sky on the other side, a detail that strongly implies that its purpose was not access, but enactment, where walking through the frame itself was the meaningful act. In many Andean traditions, ritual movement through designated openings represented transformation, initiation, or boundary crossing between different ages, social roles, or spiritual conditions, meaning that the Gate of the Moon may have been used to formalize transitions that could not be expressed through ordinary architecture. The isolation of the gate also ensured that any ritual performed there would be detached from everyday domestic life, reinforcing its separation from ordinary activity and preserving its identity as a space solely for symbolic action rather than practical use. No large cemetery has been documented adjacent to the gate, which suggests it was not primarily funerary, yet its alignment with ridgelines and open horizons may indicate astronomical significance linked to seasonal lunar movement, even if precise observational markers have not yet been definitively mapped. As with many high-altitude Andean sites, erosion and seismic activity have reshaped the surrounding rock over centuries, potentially erasing associated features such as platforms, steps, or altars that may once have stood near the portal, leaving the gate visually alone, even if it was not architecturally solitary at the time of construction. Local oral traditions often describe the gate as a place of spiritual testing or transformation, though these accounts reflect later cultural reinterpretations rather than direct survival of the original builder's beliefs. Yet they still demonstrate that the site retained sacred meaning across generations, even as political systems changed around it. Unlike imperial Inca constructions that followed standardized proportions and repeating patterns across vast territories, the Gate of the Moon lacks direct architectural duplicates, again reinforcing the idea that it belonged to an older or parallel ritual tradition rather than to the centralized planning typical of later states. The Andean region contains numerous carved niches, doorways, and rock shrines that appear similarly disconnected from nearby settlements, suggesting a broader pattern of sacred stone architecture embedded directly into the mountains themselves rather than into constructed temple complexes. Together, these sites hint at a worldview in which the landscape itself served as the primary sacred architecture, with isolated portals and carved spaces acting as direct interfaces between human ritual and the perceived consciousness of the mountains. From a purely engineering perspective, carving such a precise rectangular portal into solid mountain rock without the assistance of steel tools or mechanized drilling represents an extraordinary investment of time and labor for a structure that offers no defensive or residential utility, reinforcing the conclusion that its importance must have been entirely symbolic. The Gate of the Moon therefore stands as physical evidence that ancient Andean builders were willing to commit enormous effort to constructions whose value did not lie in habitation, storage, or military power, but in spiritual function alone. In this sense, the gate symbolizes a different relationship between architecture and purpose, one in which stone was shaped not to create shelter from the world, but to create a controlled passage through it. Unlike temples that gather people inside enclosed spaces, this portal frames the open sky itself as the destination, drawing attention not to what lies within, but to the act of crossing and the state of awareness that follows. Long after the builders vanished, and long after the societies that maintained its rituals dissolved under conquest, migration, and environmental change, the gate remains fixed within the mountain face, still framing the same sky, still receiving the same light, and still offering no explanation beyond its silent physical presence. In the absence of written records, its purpose cannot be recovered with certainty and must remain inferred through landscape, alignment, and cultural pattern rather than proven function. What the Gate of the Moon ultimately confirms is that ancient Andean civilization expressed meaning not only through cities and fortresses, but also through solitary acts of stone carving placed deliberately in the most exposed and demanding parts of the natural world. It remains a reminder that architecture does not always grow around human settlement, and sometimes exists instead as an isolated dialogue between human intention and the living mountain itself. The Great Wall of Peru, Chankillo. On a dry ridge overlooking the desert coast of northern Peru, far from the great stone cities of the later Andes and far from the imperial roads of the Inca world, stands one of the oldest and most precise astronomical instruments ever built in the Americas, a line of 13 massive stone towers rising from the hilltop in deliberate sequence, known today as Chankillo, a site that functioned not as a fortress, not as a city wall, but as a complete solar observatory carved directly into the landscape more than 2,000 years ago. From a distance, the towers look like the broken teeth of a giant stone spine running along the crest of a narrow ridge, evenly spaced yet irregular in height and shape. each tower positioned not for defence or shelter, but for visibility against the sky, forming what researchers now recognise as a carefully engineered horizon calendar designed to track the annual movement of the sun with remarkable accuracy. The 13 towers stretch across roughly 300 metres of ridgeline, and their alignment is so precise that when viewed from specific observation points on either side of the ridge, the sun rises and sets in direct alignment with different towers on different days of the year, effectively turning the entire horizon into a working solar clock that marks time not by mechanical gears, but by shadow, light, and seasonal movement. At the northernmost position of the sun's yearly path, the December solstice sunrise aligns with one extreme end of the tower sequence, and at the southernmost position, the June solstice aligns with the opposite extreme, while every day in between corresponds to a distinct point along the line, allowing trained observers to determine the date with an accuracy that rivals much later instruments. This means that Chankillo is not merely associated with solar observation, but represents a complete observational system capable of tracking the full annual cycle of the sun across the horizon, something that very few ancient cultures anywhere in the world achieved with such clarity and permanence. Nearby, on both the eastern and western sides of the tower ridge, archaeologists have identified specific observation platforms where individuals would have stood to watch the sun rise or set through the stone markers, confirming that the towers were not symbolic monuments, but active instruments built to be used repeatedly across generations. The civilization that built Chankillo flourished around the 4th century BCE, long before the rise of the Inca Empire and even before many of the large ceremonial centres that later came to define Andean civilization, meaning that this solar observatory belongs to an early and still poorly understood cultural phase of coastal Peru. The site sits within the Casma Valley, a region shaped by extreme environmental contrasts where desert meets seasonal river systems, making accurate calendrical knowledge essential. For agriculture, irrigation scheduling, ceremonial timing, and political authority. In such an environment, knowing precisely when seasonal changes would arrive could determine whether crops survived or failed, giving solar knowledge direct economic and survival value rather than purely symbolic importance. The towers themselves are built from locally quarried stone, stacked into tall, narrow forms that follow the natural contour of the ridge, each tower separated by a carefully calculated distance that transforms the irregular landscape into a mathematical horizon calibrated to the movement of the sun. Unlike later observatories that rely on carved sighting channels or enclosed instruments, Chankillo uses open air, open sky, and the natural curve of the Earth itself as part of its observational design, meaning that the environment is not separate from the instrument, but an essential component of how it functions. What makes Chankillo especially significant in the global history of science is that it represents the earliest known complete solar observatory in the Americas, predating similar large-scale horizon calendar systems found in later Andean and Mesoamerican cultures by many centuries. This confirms that advanced astronomical observation did not spread to the Andes from later civilizations, but emerged locally through long-term sky watching, seasonal pattern recognition, and systematic stone construction. Despite the precision of its astronomical function, Chankillo is also enclosed by heavy stone walls and defensive features that resemble a fortified hilltop complex, creating a rare hybrid structure where scientific observation, ritual activity, and military architecture intersect within a single controlled landscape. At first glance, the outer walls might suggest a fortress built for warfare, yet no large residential population appears to have lived permanently inside, indicating that the site's primary role was not habitation, but controlled access to a specialized ritual and observational center. The presence of defensive architecture suggests that control over the solar calendar was not merely a religious matter, but a source of political power, because whoever governed the timing of planting, harvest, and seasonal ceremony would also govern the rhythm of the entire surrounding population. In societies without formal mechanical clocks or written almanacs, monumental observatories like Chankillo became the physical authority of time itself, transforming stone structures into the regulators of social order. The 13-tower system also reveals that the builders understood the long-term stability of solar cycles, because such an instrument only works if its creators recognized that the sun's movement across the horizon repeats with consistent annual regularity. This kind of knowledge can only emerge through generations of careful observation, long-term record-keeping transmitted orally, and sustained commitment to preserving observational accuracy over time. No inscriptions survive that explicitly describe the calculations behind Chankillo's design, yet the structure itself preserves the calculation in physical form, embedding astronomical knowledge directly into stone that has endured long after the knowledge system that created it faded from memory. The surrounding desert landscape has preserved Chankillo with relatively little disturbance, although erosion, looting, and natural decay have damaged some structures, and sections of the ridge have collapsed under centuries of seismic activity and wind exposure. Even so, the alignment of the towers remains sufficiently intact that modern researchers can still stand at the ancient observation points and watch the sun rise or set between the same stone markers that ancient observers used more than 2,000 years ago. This continuity of function across millennia gives Chankillo a rare status among archaeological sites, because it still performs the precise task for which it was originally built, without restoration or reconstruction altering its fundamental design. Unlike mythic solar monuments that are often associated with speculative interpretations, Chankillo's function can be tested directly through repeated observation, making it one of the clearest examples of prehistoric applied astronomy ever documented. At the same time, its builders left no written explanations for why this particular ridge was chosen or how the system was formally taught to new generations of observers, meaning that while the instrument remains visible, the institutional structure that maintained it is lost. The location itself was not chosen for scenic beauty or strategic dominance alone, but for its clear eastern and western horizons, which allow the full solar arc to be tracked without obstruction across the year. This reinforces the idea that the site was selected primarily based on astronomical necessity rather than political or residential convenience. Chankillo challenges the assumption that early complex science required large urban centres or formal state bureaucracies, because here a relatively early coastal society constructed a monument whose sophistication rivals the best-known solar observatories of much later civilizations. It demonstrates that precise mathematical astronomy can develop independently wherever long-term environmental observation, cultural continuity, and political motivation intersect. Long after the civilization that built it disappeared, and long after new empires rose and fell across the Andes, the 13 towers continued to mark the silent movement of the sun, rising and setting each day without regard for the human systems that once depended upon them. The Persian stone giants of Naqsh-e Rostam. Cut high into a sheer limestone cliff in southern Iran, where the desert plain meets the mountains of ancient Persia, stand 4 colossal rock-cut tombs that dominate the landscape with an authority that has outlived the empire that created them, a site now known as Naqsh-e Rostam, where kings were not buried beneath the earth but raised above it, suspended in stone faces carved directly into a vertical wall of living rock. Unlike ground-level tombs or hidden burial chambers, these monuments were designed to be seen from great distances, their massive facades positioned high above human reach, accessible only by scaffolding at the time of construction and completely unreachable once finished, ensuring that the dead rulers would remain permanently elevated above the world they once governed. Each tomb is carved in the shape of a giant cross-like facade, with a tall vertical shaft intersected by a horizontal beam, creating the form of a colossal doorway cut into the mountain itself. And at the centre of each facade lies a sealed entrance that once led into the burial chamber, now empty after centuries of disturbance. These tombs belong to the rulers of the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian superpower, which between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE controlled a territory stretching from the borders of India to the Mediterranean Sea, becoming the largest empire the world had ever seen at that time. The most prominent and securely identified of these tombs belongs to Darius the First, the ruler who transformed the Persian state into a centralized imperial system with standardized law, taxation, currency, and road networks, and whose burial place was carved with inscriptions that still proclaim his authority in multiple ancient languages. Beside him are the tombs of later kings, including Xerxes I, whose reign would later become entangled in the wars between Persia and the Greek world, yet whose final resting place was prepared not in the lowlands of his capitals, but in this immovable wall of stone overlooking the heartland of the empire. The decision to carve these tombs vertically into a cliff was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a calculated statement of permanence and divine authority, because in Persian royal ideology, the king stood as a mediator between the human world and the divine order, and elevating the tomb above the ground symbolically separated royal death from ordinary human burial. Above each tomb entrance is a carved relief showing the king standing before a sacred fire altar with symbols of divine authority floating above him, presenting an image not of death but of eternal kingship sanctioned by cosmic order rather than earthly succession. The scale of labour required to execute these carvings is enormous, because every surface of each facade had to be cut directly out of vertical stone using iron tools, with no possibility of horizontal quarrying, meaning that all work was done while suspended on scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground. At this height, every mistake would be irreversible, and every collapse of scaffolding would be fatal, yet the precision of the carvings reveals that the builders were not improvising, but working from carefully planned designs that had been mapped onto the cliff face in advance. Inside each tomb, small internal chambers were hollowed into the rock to receive the royal sarcophagus, once sealed permanently after burial, not meant to be reopened or visited again, which emphasizes that these spaces were not for ritual interaction, but for an eternal separation between royal body and living population. The choice of Naqsh-e Rostam as a burial site is also significant because it lies only a few kilometres from Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, ensuring that the living court would always exist in the shadow of the ancestral kings carved into stone. This created a political landscape where past and present monarchy were physically fused into the same terrain, reinforcing dynastic legitimacy through constant visual presence rather than through written genealogy alone. Centuries after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire to the armies of Alexander the Great, the site did not lose its symbolic authority, because later rulers of the Sasanian Empire carved massive reliefs directly beneath the earlier tombs, depicting their own military victories and royal ceremonies as if to claim the same divine sanction once held by the ancient Persian kings. These later reliefs show Persian emperors receiving rings of kingship from deities and trampling defeated Roman emperors beneath their horses, turning the cliff into a layered political document where successive empires inscribed their legitimacy directly beneath the stone faces of their predecessors. In this way, Naqsh-e Rostam became not just a burial site, but a continuous imperial gallery where nearly 1,000 years of Persian power was expressed through rock-cut imagery rather than movable monuments. Unlike freestanding statues that can be toppled, transported, or erased, these cliff carvings cannot be removed without destroying the mountain itself, meaning that every empire that used this site made the deliberate decision to fuse its authority permanently with the landscape. The tombs themselves reveal a culture that rejected secrecy and royal death, because instead of hiding their kings underground, the Persians elevated them into public view, where every traveller across the plain would be reminded of dynastic power even long after the empire's political control had vanished. No treasure cache remains within the tomb chambers today because they were emptied by ancient grave robbers long ago, yet the absence of material wealth does not diminish the symbolic force of the tombs, which were never meant to display riches but to display permanence, unlike Egyptian pyramids that conceal royal bodies within sealed internal passages. The Persian approach placed the body beyond physical reach, making proximity itself impossible and turning elevation into the primary protective mechanism. This architectural choice reflects a worldview in which protection came not from hidden complexity, but from visible separation, placing kings where neither common people nor ordinary enemies could physically follow. The craftsmanship of the tomb facades shows standardized imperial proportions rather than individual artistic freedom, indicating that royal death followed a fixed ideological blueprint rather than personal preference. This suggests that Persian kingship was an institution that outlived individual rulers, with each new king stepping into the same symbolic role that his predecessors had occupied, reinforced by identical architectural form rather than personal monument design. Weathering has softened the edges of the carvings over time, and earthquakes have fractured parts of the cliff face. Yet the main forms of the tombs remain unmistakable even after more than 2,000 years of exposure to sun, wind, and seismic movement. The tombs do not dominate by size alone, but by isolation, because no other structure at the site rises to their height or competes with their placement, ensuring that every line of sight is ultimately drawn upward toward the carved kings. What makes Naqsh-e Rostam especially powerful is that it compresses the entire Persian imperial story into a single vertical surface, where life, conquest, divine law, and death all merge into a continuous stone narrative. There are no long written histories carved across the cliff, yet through placement, scale, and repetition, the site communicates an unmistakable message of continuity, authority, and cosmic legitimacy. Even after Persia fell under foreign rule multiple times, the tombs were never erased or defaced on a large scale, which suggests that later cultures recognized the weight of what these carvings represented and chose to appropriate their power rather than destroy it. Today, visitors stand on the plain beneath the towering rock face and look upward at tombs placed impossibly high for any human-scale purpose, confronted with an ancient political philosophy written directly into the mountain. The stone giants of Naqsh-e Rostam are not giants because of myth or legend, but because they embody a worldview where rulers sought to transcend mortality, not through hidden burial but through total fusion with the eternal substance of the earth itself. Long after armies dissolved and palaces collapsed into dust, the Persian kings remain fixed in the cliff, not as preserved bodies, but as carved authority, watching silently over a land that has changed its rulers, languages, and religions many times since their empire first rose. The Cyclopean ramp of Baalbek quarry. On the eastern edge of the fertile Bekaa Valley in modern-day Lebanon, near the monumental ruins of Baalbek, lies a vast limestone quarry that contains some of the largest stones ever cut by human hands, a place where unfinished blocks weighing hundreds and even thousands of tons still rest exactly where they were carved, and where traces of an ancient ramp system suggest how these impossible masses were once intended to be moved. This quarry is inseparably linked to the colossal temple complex of Baalbek itself, where the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter are built with megalithic blocks so massive that even modern cranes would struggle to lift them safely, raising a fundamental engineering question that has never fully been resolved, which is how pre-industrial builders managed to transport stones weighing close to 1,000 tons using nothing but human labour, gravity control, and mechanical ingenuity. Among these stones is a block long known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and more recently, even larger blocks have been identified still attached to the quarry bedrock, some estimated to exceed 1,000 tons in weight, making them the largest single stones ever known to have been intentionally cut for construction. The proximity of these stones to the temple site immediately suggests that the quarry was not an isolated industrial zone, but an integrated part of a planned construction system in which extraction, shaping, transport, and placement were designed as a single continuous process. The quarry sits slightly higher than the temple platform itself, a seemingly simple geographic detail that becomes central to understanding how transport was possible at all, because if a stone could be moved downhill in a controlled way rather than lifted upward, Its movement could be governed through friction, rollers, sledges, and carefully engineered ramps rather than brute vertical lifting. Archaeological evidence suggests that long earthen and stone ramps once connected the quarry directly to the construction platform, creating gradual sloped pathways over which the megaliths could be slid rather than lifted, using the natural advantage of gravity in a carefully managed way. These ramps would not have been narrow paths, but enormous artificial earthworks, wide enough to carry the full width of the stone blocks, packed tightly to prevent collapse under extreme weight, and maintained constantly during transport operations as the stones moved slowly forward by only a few meters per day. The actual movement of these blocks would have required hundreds, possibly thousands, of workers operating in coordinated teams, pulling with ropes, controlling speed with braking systems made of wood and stone, and constantly managing the balance of the block to prevent tipping, cracking, or uncontrolled sliding. What makes the Baalbek operation so unusual is not just the absolute scale of the stones, but the fact that they were clearly meant to be placed with extreme precision, because the foundation stones at the temple complex are fitted together with joints so tight that even a thin blade cannot be inserted between them, meaning that transport was not only about power, but also about millimetre level control. The engineering logic behind this operation becomes even more striking when considered in the context of the Roman Empire, which later expanded Baalbek into one of the grandest sacred complexes in the ancient world, because while the Romans were master builders, even by their standards, the size of these foundation stones was extraordinary and unnecessary for ordinary structural stability. This has led many scholars to propose that the massive megaliths predate the final Roman phase temples and were part of an earlier monumental platform that the Romans later incorporated rather than originated, adopting a pre-existing Cyclopean foundation whose purpose may have been symbolic as much as structural. Regardless of who first conceived the platform, the quarry evidence makes clear that the builders planned from the beginning to work at a scale far beyond practical necessity, investing resources into stone sizes that far exceeded what was required for stability alone. From an engineering perspective, smaller blocks could have achieved the same structural strength with far less difficulty, meaning that the decision to use such enormous stones reflects a deliberate pursuit of monumentality rather than efficiency. The ramps themselves were not permanent stone roads, but dynamic construction tools that were built, reshaped, and eventually dismantled as the project progressed, which explains why only traces remain visible today in soil layers and degraded stone alignments rather than as intact architectural features. Experiments using scaled-down replicas of Baalbek-style sledges have demonstrated that with sufficient manpower, lubrication, and slope control, stones weighing dozens of tons can be moved with primitive technology, but extrapolating those results to nearly 1,000-ton blocks pushes the limits of known experimental archaeology. At Baalbek, however, the quarry blocks themselves prove beyond doubt that the ancient builders fully intended to move stones of this size, because they invested the labour to extract and partially shape them while still attached to bedrock, a process that would have been pointless if transport had not been considered achievable. One of the strongest indications that ramp-based transport was planned lies in the orientation of the blocks themselves, which align with the most natural slope direction from quarry to platform, suggesting that extraction angle and exit direction were calculated in advance as part of the transport strategy. The rhythm of work in the quarry would have been slow and highly coordinated, with teams carving channels around each block, isolating it from the bedrock over months or years, gradually reducing the contact points until the stone could finally be separated and placed onto a prepared sled. This final separation alone would have been one of the most dangerous moments in the entire operation, because a sudden uneven release could crack the block or cause uncontrolled movement. For this reason, the process likely involved incremental undercutting supported by temporary stone and wooden braces, with the final detachment carried out in stages rather than as a single violent release. The fact that several of the largest stones remain abandoned in the quarry suggests that technical, logistical, or political conditions changed before they could be transported, possibly due to shifts in funding, leadership, or regional control that abruptly halted further movement. These abandoned giants freeze a moment of interrupted ambition, offering rare physical evidence of a construction project that reached the absolute edge of what ancient engineering could realistically achieve. Unlike myths that imagine lost machines or unknown technologies, the evidence at Baalbek overwhelmingly points toward human-powered systems amplified through scale, coordination, terrain advantage, and mechanical understanding, rather than through any form of advanced machinery. This makes the Baalbek ramp problem not a mystery of impossible technology, but a demonstration of what becomes possible when enormous labour forces, long timelines, and precise planning are applied without compromise toward monumental goals. At the same time, the choice to build in this way reveals something important about ancient political power, because only a society capable of mobilizing massive labour over many years could afford to pursue construction at such an extravagant scale. Whether under earlier local rulers or under the later Roman administration, the megalithic foundations of Baalbek represent not merely religious devotion, but a direct physical expression of authority over human bodies, time, and landscape. The ramp system therefore becomes more than a technical solution, because it also embodies a social structure in which thousands of workers could be directed toward a single purpose, with no immediate practical return beyond symbolic display. In this sense, the Baalbek quarry is not just a place of stone extraction, but a fossilized labour system preserved in unfinished form, where the marks of chisels, wedges, and isolation trenches still record the tempo of work more clearly than written records ever could. Even today, standing beside these massive blocks, human scale collapses completely as the length of a single stone matches the width of a modern street, and its height rises beyond the reach of any standard lifting equipment. The unfinished state of the largest blocks allows modern observers to reconstruct not only how they were meant to be moved, but also how close ancient engineers came to the absolute physical limits of stone transport using pre-industrial means. The Cyclopean ramp of Baalbek quarry therefore stands as one of the clearest physical demonstrations that ancient engineering was not constrained by small thinking, but by calculated risk taken to its furthest possible extreme. Long after the temple rituals ended, long after Roman authority vanished from the region, the quarry remains open and silent, with its giants still half freed from the mountain, preserving a moment when ambition stretched human engineering to its outer edge. What remains unresolved is not whether the stones could be moved, because many already were, but how often such extreme methods were attempted elsewhere and left no surviving quarry evidence behind. Baalbek endures because its builders pushed scale so far that even unfinished work became indestructible, leaving behind not only a monument to gods and emperors, but to the raw limits of what organised human labour can physically accomplish. The horned skulls of Sayre, in the quiet river valleys of northeastern Pennsylvania, where modern towns sit calmly beside slow-moving water and wooded hills, a strange story quietly entered American archaeological folklore in the late 19th century, centred on a small town now called Sayre, where reports emerged of human skeletons unlike any recorded in standard anatomy, skulls marked by large, horn-like bony protrusions rising from the forehead. According to newspaper accounts published in the 1880s, workers excavating burial mounds along the upper Susquehanna River uncovered dozens of skeletons described as unusually tall, with elongated skulls and prominent bone growths shaped like horns, and these discoveries were quickly attributed to an unknown ancient population that had once occupied the valley long before European settlement. At the time, the region was already known for its Native American burial mounds, remnants of prehistoric cultures that had lived along the river system for thousands of years, and such excavations were often conducted with little scientific oversight, meaning that early reports relied almost entirely on eyewitness description rather than controlled archaeological documentation. Newspapers across the United States rapidly spread the story, describing skeletons said to belong to a horned race, with skull features so strange that reporters compared them to mythological beings rather than ordinary humans. And within months, the Sayre discovery entered popular imagination as evidence of a vanished people unlike any known tribe. Some reports claimed that up to 68 skeletons were removed from a single mound near the river, many displaying the same horn-like growths, while others described massive stature and unusual bone thickness. Though no consistent measurements were ever formally published in scientific journals, what makes the Sayre case so difficult to evaluate today is that none of the original skeletons are known to survive in verified museum collections, and if they were transferred to any institution at all, their exact fate was never clearly recorded in permanent archives. The only confirmed institutional reference tied to the story connects the discovery loosely with early anthropological collecting activity associated with the Smithsonian Institution, although the institution itself has long stated that it holds no verified horned human skulls and that no such specimens exist in its catalogue today. This absence of physical evidence immediately places the Sayre story into a rare category where historical documentation exists, but the material proof no longer does, forcing modern researchers to evaluate the case almost entirely through secondary reports rather than direct analysis. From a biological perspective, modern medicine does recognise rare conditions that can cause abnormal bony growths on the skull, including osteomas, cutaneous horns, and advanced cases of hyperostosis, where bone grows outward beyond its normal boundaries, sometimes producing horn-like shapes under the skin. Such conditions, however, are extremely rare on a large population scale and typically develop asymmetrically rather than producing identical horn-like structures across dozens of individuals, which makes the Sayre descriptions difficult to reconcile with known medical disorders alone. Another possibility raised by researchers is that the horns observed were not true horns at all, but the result of post-mortem damage, mineral encrustation, or misidentification of thickened cranial ridges that were exaggerated through sensational reportings in a period when newspapers often favoured dramatic interpretation over anatomical precision. The late 19th century was also the height of America's fascination with so-called ancient giants, lost races, and mysterious mound-building civilizations, and many genuine archaeology stories were embellished to fit public expectations of prehistoric mystery rather than sober scientific explanation. At the same time, the burial mounds of the upper Susquehanna region are real and well documented, and they belong to successive indigenous cultures that occupied the area over thousands of years, meaning that the skeletons described were almost certainly human remains belonging to native populations rather than members of any unknown race. What remains unresolved is whether any of the skulls truly exhibited abnormal horn-like growths, or whether the entire feature emerged through exaggeration, misinterpretation, or even fabricated reporting intended to increase newspaper circulation during an era of sensational archaeology. The Sayre case also highlights a deeper issue in early American archaeology, which is that many excavations were conducted by non-specialists with little regard for precise measurement, stratigraphic recording, or skeletal preservation, resulting in permanent loss of critical contextual information that cannot be recovered today. Because of this, even if unusual skulls were genuinely present, the lack of controlled documentation now makes it impossible to determine whether those features represented disease, rare genetic mutation, cultural modification, or simple misobservation. Unlike artificial cranial deformation practices seen in some ancient cultures, where skulls were deliberately reshaped during infancy using binding techniques, horn-like protrusions cannot be produced through shaping alone, meaning that if the horns were real bone growths, they would represent pathological conditions rather than cultural modification. Another factor complicating the Sayre story is that later retellings gradually mixed the original reports with broader legends of giants, monsters, and hybrid beings, transforming what may have begun as a medical anomaly into a mythological narrative far removed from the original excavation context. Modern archaeologists working in the region today find no clear evidence of a distinct horned population and instead identify the mound sites as part of known indigenous cultural traditions that practice complex burial rituals, long-term settlement along river systems, and sophisticated management of local ecosystems. In this sense, the Sayre horned skulls story becomes less a window into a forgotten species and more a case study in how fragile archaeological truth can be when speculation overtakes verification and when physical evidence disappears before proper scientific review can occur. What makes the story persist is precisely that absence of proof, because without surviving skulls to analyse, the claim can neither be conclusively confirmed nor completely disproven, leaving it suspended between curiosity and folklore rather than within the realm of resolved science. The continued repetition of the story across alternative history media reflects a broader human tendency to search for lost races, forgotten giants, and hidden chapters of prehistory, even when simpler explanations rooted in pathology or misreporting often remain more consistent with known biology. Yet even within this uncertainty, the Sayre case still serves an important role in understanding how early archaeology in North America developed, how indigenous burial sites were frequently disturbed without adequate documentation, and how newspaper culture shaped public understanding of ancient history long before professional standards were established. The true tragedy of the story may not be whether horned skulls actually existed, but that the human remains described were removed from their burial mounds without proper scientific care and without cultural respect at a time when indigenous sites were routinely excavated for curiosity rather than preservation. In the modern era, archaeology has shifted toward ethical practice, repatriation, and collaboration with native communities to ensure that ancient burials are no longer treated as oddities or spectacles, but as ancestors deserving of dignity. From that perspective, the Sayre horned skulls stand as a reminder not of an unknown species of humanity, but of a transitional moment in archaeological history when mystery often overshadowed responsibility. What remains today is not a collection of skulls that can be measured, scanned, and analysed, but a layered narrative composed of rumour, early reporting, institutional denial, medical possibility, and cultural legend intertwined into a single unresolved case. And until verifiable physical evidence ever resurfaces, the horned skulls of Sayre must remain not as proof of a lost race, but as an enduring example of how easily archaeology can slide into mythology when documentation fails and speculation fills the void. The Waffle Rock. In the quiet grasslands of northeastern South Africa, far from monumental temples, royal tombs, and engineered megastructures, there exists a single natural stone formation that has sparked decades of confusion, speculation, and scientific investigation. A block of rock patterned so perfectly with a grid of raised squares that it resembles something manufactured rather than formed by geological processes. A formation known locally as the Waffle Rock. At first glance, the surface of the rock looks artificial, as though it were cast in a mould or stamped by a machine, with evenly spaced rectangular ridges crossing in both directions to create a surface pattern strikingly similar to a man-made waffle iron or a piece of industrial flooring, an appearance that immediately challenges ordinary expectations of how natural rock should look. The rock itself lies exposed at ground level in an open natural landscape, not embedded in any known archaeological site, not associated with ruins, tools, or cultural debris, and not positioned in any way that suggests deliberate placement by human hands, yet its surface texture continues to provoke questions, precisely because of how mechanical and repetitive it appears. Unlike carved stone blocks that show tool marks, chisel scars, or directional cutting lines, the pattern on the Waffle Rock is continuous across the entire visible surface, with no obvious starting point, no interruption consistent with human workmanship, and no evidence of individual stone blocks assembled together, but rather a single continuous slab of natural rock. For many years, images of the formation circulated online and in alternative history media with claims that it had been created by an ancient lost civilization. an unknown machine, or even advanced technology from a forgotten age, largely because the grid pattern looked too precise to be natural in the eyes of casual observers, unfamiliar with complex geological processes. From a scientific perspective, however, the explanation lies not in hidden civilizations, but in the deep mechanics of rock formation, pressure, and erosion acting over immense spans of time, far beyond the scale of human history. The rock is composed primarily of sandstone, a sedimentary material formed from compacted sand deposited in ancient riverbeds, floodplains, or shallow marine environments, later turned into solid stone through pressure and mineral cementation over millions of years. The grid-like pattern visible on the surface is the result of a natural process known as jointing, where internal stresses build up within the rock mass due to tectonic pressure, temperature changes, and structural contraction during slow uplift of the surrounding land. As these internal stresses release, the rock fractures along predictable planes of weakness, often forming perpendicular joint sets that intersect at near right angles, creating a blocky internal structure within the stone, long before it is ever exposed at the surface. Over additional millions of years, wind, rain, and chemical weathering preferentially erode the weaker joint boundaries while leaving the more resistant core material intact, slowly sculpting a surface where raised square ridges remain while the surrounding material is worn away. What appears at first glance to be a moulded grid is therefore the final exposed cross-section of an internal fracture network that already existed inside the rock long before human beings ever appeared on Earth. Similar joint-controlled weathering patterns can be found in many parts of the world, in basalt columns, limestone pavements, and eroded sandstone cliffs, though few display the same regularity and shallow relief seen on the waffle rock, which is why it attracts such strong visual curiosity. The relatively flat topography of the surrounding land allowed this particular block to remain stable and exposed rather than collapsing into talus slopes or breaking apart into separate boulders, preserving the grid pattern in one continuous piece rather than as scattered fragments. Another factor that enhances the artificial appearance of the pattern is scale, because the individual square ridges are approximately uniform in width and spacing, creating a visual rhythm that closely resembles laid tile or engineered concrete blocks rather than fractured natural stone. From a mechanical standpoint, however, such uniformity can occur naturally when the original stress field within the rock mass was evenly distributed, causing joints to form at relatively consistent intervals throughout the material. Importantly, close inspection of the surface reveals rounded edges, irregular microfractures, and mineral staining consistent with long-term natural exposure rather than sharp machined edges, further confirming that the formation is the result of geological weathering rather than cutting, casting, or carving. No tool marks are present, no associated cultural artifacts have ever been recovered from the site, and no subsurface structures exist beneath the rock that would suggest it was part of a buried architectural complex. Despite this, the waffle rock continues to appear in discussions of unexplained artifacts, largely because it illustrates how strongly the human brain is wired to interpret geometric order as evidence of intentional design, even when that order can emerge spontaneously through natural physical laws. The history of science is filled with similar examples where natural processes once mistaken for artificial structures were later understood through physics, chemistry, and geology, and the waffle rock belongs firmly within that category of misunderstood natural patterning rather than lost engineering. At the same time, the formation holds genuine scientific value because it provides a clear, visible example of how stress fracturing and differential erosion interact over long timescales to produce highly ordered surface geometry, without any biological or technological involvement. For geologists, it functions as a natural laboratory in which joint spacing, erosion rates, and sedimentary layering can be studied directly without excavation or destructive testing. For the public, however, it remains visually deceptive precisely because it sits in an open field rather than in a cliff wall or canyon face, where similar joint patterns are more commonly recognized as natural. The isolation of the rock enhances the illusion of construction, making it appear as though it were deliberately placed rather than simply revealed by slow erosion of its surrounding material. In this way, the waffle rock demonstrates how context shapes interpretation, because the same grid pattern viewed inside a quarry or canyon wall would hardly attract notice, while viewed alone in open grassland, it invites speculation of human intention. Unlike many of the other sites in this documentary series, the waffle rock does not represent lost engineering, vanished empires, or buried civilizations, but instead reveals something equally important about the limits of human perception when confronted with unfamiliar natural order. It shows that complexity does not always require intelligence, and that symmetry does not always require design, because nature itself is capable of producing patterns that easily rival human construction in precision and regularity. Over time, tourism and repeated visitation have worn parts of the surface through foot traffic and exposure, and conservation efforts now aim to limit direct contact with the rock to preserve its fragile ridges from accelerated erosion. As scientific understanding of geological weathering continues to develop, formations like the waffle rock remain valuable not as mysteries of unknown builders, but as physical records of slow planetary processes operating far outside the rhythm of human life. While empires rise and fall, machines are invented and rust away, and civilizations erase and rewrite their own histories, the internal fracture networks of stone continue evolving invisibly beneath the surface, awaiting the slow patience of erosion to bring them into the open. The waffle rock therefore stands not as evidence of forgotten technology, but as a quiet reminder that Earth itself is the oldest engineer of all, shaping form through pressure, fracture, and time, on a scale that no human construction can rival. The ancient map of Antarctica. In 1929, inside the preserved archives of the old imperial palace in Istanbul, a fragment of a centuries-old world map quietly resurfaced into modern history, a map that would later become one of the most debated cartographic artifacts of the 20th century, known today as the Peary Race Map, a document that appeared to show portions of the world with a level of coastal accuracy that far exceeded what many believed was possible at the time it was drawn. The map was created in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and navigator Piri Reis, a sailor who spent much of his life navigating the Mediterranean and compiling geographic knowledge gathered from older charts, sailors' accounts, and earlier maps captured during maritime conflicts and trade encounters. Only about 1/3 of the original map survives today, and that surviving fragment shows parts of Western Europe, North Africa, and the eastern coastline of South America, all drawn with surprising precision for an era when long-distance ocean navigation was still in its early stages. What transformed this map from a historical curiosity into a global controversy was the claim that the southern portion of the map appeared to depict a landmass that closely resembled the ice-free coastline of Antarctica, centuries before the continent was officially discovered in 1820. If true, that would imply that someone, somewhere, possessed accurate geographic knowledge of Antarctica long before modern exploration, at a time when the continent was believed to be entirely unknown and buried beneath miles of ice. At first sight, this claim seems extraordinary, because Antarctica's coastline lies hidden beneath massive ice sheets, and even today its true underlying shape can only be determined through radar and seismic mapping. However, careful examination of the Peary Race map shows that its southern coastline aligns only approximately with the shape of South America's southern extension and nearby speculative continental outlines, rather than matching the confirmed sub-ice profile of Antarctica with precise accuracy. Peary Rice himself explicitly stated in his map notes that he compiled his work from multiple earlier sources, including Portuguese charts, Arab maps, and a now lost map purportedly drawn during the time of Christopher Columbus, meaning that his work was not based on direct exploration alone, but on accumulated cartographic tradition. This matters because early mapmakers often combined confirmed coastlines with theoretical southern continents that were believed to exist for philosophical and climatic balance rather than based on direct observation. For centuries, European and Islamic scholars believed in a vast unnamed southern landmass, sometimes called Terra Australis, thought necessary to balance the northern continent of Earth, and this theoretical continent appeared on many early maps long before Antarctica was actually located. When the shape on the Piri Reis map is compared carefully to accurate Antarctic coastal data, the resemblance becomes far less exact than popular claims suggest, and most professional cartographers agree that the southern landmass on the map aligns more closely with a misrepresented southern extension of South America combined with speculative southern continent outlines rather than a true depiction of Antarctica itself. Another major argument against the idea of ancient Antarctic mapping is geological reality, because Antarctica has been covered in thick ice sheets for at least the last several million years, making direct observation of its rock coastline impossible during the entire span of human civilization. Even if a prehistoric culture had possessed advanced maritime navigation, they would still have encountered a frozen ice wall rather than exposed land unless they existed in a period far earlier than any known civilization. What gives the Piri Reis map its continuing mystery is not that it definitively shows Antarctica, but that it demonstrates just how advanced coastal navigation and longitudinal estimation had become in parts of the world by the early 16th century, long before most people assume accurate global mapping was possible. The eastern coastline of South America on the map shows correct relative placement and curvature that align closely with modern charts, demonstrating that Portuguese explorers had already gathered remarkably precise geographic data during the early phase of Atlantic exploration. This level of accuracy can be explained through systematic astronomical observation, dead reckoning navigation, repeated voyages, and accumulated knowledge passed between maritime cultures rather than through lost technologies or vanished super-civilizations. The misconceptions surrounding Antarctica's appearance on the map grew largely during the mid-20th century when alternative history writers proposed that ancient ice-free maps of Antarctica must have been inherited from an unknown Ice Age civilization whose knowledge was later copied and redistributed through medieval mapmakers. These claims gained popularity because they offered dramatic explanations for otherwise technical cartographic achievements and appealed strongly to the idea of forgotten global empires far older than accepted history. However, when subjected to rigorous geodetic comparison, scaling analysis, and projection correction, the supposed Antarctic coastline shows inconsistencies in latitude, curvature, and orientation that contradict the underlying rock profile of Antarctica beneath the ice. Modern scientists instead conclude that the landmass on the map is best explained as a stylized southern extension of known land combined with speculative Terra Australis tradition rather than as a true representation of the Antarctic continent. This does not diminish the significance of the Piri Reis map itself, because it remains one of the most advanced composite nautical charts of its time, reflecting the intense global exchange of geographic knowledge that was already underway during the early 16th century. At that time, the world was undergoing a rapid expansion of maritime exploration, where Islamic navigational science, Chinese compass use, and European shipbuilding converged into a new era of global cartography. The map stands as physical proof that sailors of the early modern period were not blindly crossing unknown oceans, but were guided by increasingly accurate charts built from centuries of shared observational data. What the controversy reveals more than anything else is how easily modern interpretation can project extraordinary meaning onto historical artifacts when visual similarity is mistaken for exact correspondence. The idea that Antarctica might have been known in ancient times persists largely because the human imagination is drawn toward the possibility of lost epochs of knowledge, hidden global networks, and vanished civilizations that challenge linear models of progress. Yet documented history repeatedly shows that human navigation, astronomy, and cartography can reach high levels of precision even without electricity, satellites, or advanced machinery, using mathematics, instruments, and repeated observation alone. The danger emerges when legitimate historical achievements are dismissed as impossible and replaced with speculative civilizations that are unsupported by archaeological evidence. No verified ruins, tools, settlements, or inscriptions exist anywhere in Antarctica that predate modern exploration, and no global archaeological layer supports the existence of an advanced Ice Age maritime civilization capable of mapping polar continents. What does exist is a clear record of navigational evolution, where early mariners gradually improved their understanding of Earth's size, shape, and continental outlines through long-term cumulative effort rather than sudden hidden technological leaps. The Peary Race map occupies a critical place in that progression because it demonstrates how rapidly geographic knowledge accelerated once sustained oceanic travel began connecting distant parts of the world into a single navigational system. Rather than proving that Antarctica was mapped in ancient times, the map proves something arguably more important, which is that real historical societies were far more capable, organised, and scientifically precise than they are often given credit for in popular imagination. The mystery surrounding the map endures not because it defies science, but because it sits at the boundary between what ordinary people assume was possible and what disciplined observation can actually achieve without modern technology. As scientific understanding deepens, the map becomes less a symbol of a lost world and more a record of how knowledge actually spreads, not through secret civilizations, but through ships, sailors, ports, and inherited calculation. In that sense, the ancient map of Antarctica is not evidence of a forgotten age beneath the ice, but evidence of how easily disciplined human observation can be mistaken for impossibility when separated from its historical context. What remains unresolved is not whether Antarctica was secretly mapped in antiquity, but why the modern world continues to underestimate the intellectual achievements of its documented ancestors whenever their work appears too precise to be believed.